Hi, good afternoon. In a 16th century text describing the life and activities of the famous Maodhóg of Ferns, which Professor Wooding mentioned earlier this morning, the author dramatically declares that the power and the rights possessed by Maodhóg are due to his vast array of relics and his wonder-working insignia. Now, of all examples of Irish hagiographical texts, I think this is perhaps one that most fully and in most detail describes the importance of relics in exerting power and control in the early Irish church and society. So as today we're standing here above traditionally believed to be the relics of St. Maodhóg himself, I just wanted to set my talk to you today within this context. However, what I really want to explore is a much earlier period, the early medieval period in Ireland, which is centuries before the composition of this Irish life of Maodhóg, though I will return to that text later. So what I'm going to examine is how and why relics came to occupy such an important position in the Irish church and society. So, from a historical perspective, what exactly was the cult of relics? Relics were an intrinsic component in the veneration of saints. They were regarded as extensions of the saint's body and shared its sacred quality. In literal terms, relics were the remains of the saints. Most often this was the whole body of the saint. But relics could be parts of the body or even just objects that touched the body. Indeed, relics could theoretically be any item associated with the saint in their lifetime, such as a book or clothes. Now, saints had grown closer to Christ through death, and this intimacy could be shared with those on earth who nurtured relationships with the saints. And relics provided a physical connection to the saint. The cults of saints and relics pervaded all elements of medieval society. Through the perceived intervention of the saint they belonged to, relics were used for many purposes. For example, to heal the sick, to effect favourable changes in weather, and to ensure victory in battle. Indeed, although I am focusing today on early Irish history, it's important to mention that incidents such as the widespread media coverage of the theft and the return of the relic earlier this year of St. Lawrence O'Toole in Christchurch Cathedral in Dublin, these highlight the enduring appeal of relics in the modern age. So a key legacy of the veneration of relics in medieval Ireland is the material evidence, which has helped define our landscape and our cultural heritage. I've pictures here on the slide of an example of an early monastic site in Illawn Lochan in County Kerry, featuring an early example of an elevated saint's shrine. And I also have a photo of this beautiful metal portable reliquary known as the Breac Maodhog, associated with St. Maodhóg, which is now on display in the National Museum in Dublin. So the layout of many early Christian monasteries accommodated and enticed pilgrims seeking to venerate the tombs of the saints and to seek miraculous intervention on the saint on their behalf. Now, much excellent research on this topic has been carried out on these ecclesiastical sites and on the beautiful shrines by archaeologists and by art historians. But from my point of view as a historian, it is my job to focus on the written sources, on the documentary texts. So I aim to complement the work of archaeologists by examining what was written about relics by early Irish authors. Unfortunately, this means I'm not quite as cool as the archaeologists and I don't have lots of these lovely picture slides. But I do quote from lots of the texts, and I've put these quotes on the slides so you can see them for yourselves. Everything on the slides, I'm also speaking out loud, so it's okay if you don't read the slide, or you can just listen to me and you'll get it as well. Now, in many cases, the written sources were written by anonymous authors, and we often can't accurately date them, so hence there's a scattering of question marks around the dates and all the slides. Now, most of the earliest surviving documentary evidence in Ireland attests to the veneration of relics. So letters, church canons, law texts, hagiography, which is a genre dedicated to glorifying the life of a saint, annals, poetry, martyrologies, and penitentials. The earliest written evidence for relics in Ireland is a letter written in about the year 632 AD by Cummian, who was possibly a bishop of Clonfert on the Shannon, and he was writing about a controversy in the early Irish church concerning the correct dating of Easter. Many Irish churches were practicing Easter on a different week to parts of the rest of the Catholic Church. So, writing to other leaders of Irish churches, Cummian defends at length the superiority of Rome's calculations on Easter. And he claims that relics of the Holy Roman martyrs were sent from Rome to authenticate the Roman decree on this issue. Now, in case of any doubters, Cummian verified his argument by actually testing the efficacy of the relics. And of course, they duly produced miracles. And he says, "We saw with our own eyes a totally blind girl opening her eyes at these relics, and a paralytic walking, and many demons cast out." So effectively what Cummian is saying here is that you don't need to just trust what I'm saying. I'm backing up my argument by providing incontrovertible proof of what I'm saying because it's backed up by relics, and we've tested the relics and we've witnessed the miracles. So the authority of Rome is effectively symbolized by these relics. Now, the collection of stories about Patrick, told by a cleric known as Tyrachon, reveals how important relics were in Ireland by the late 7th century. His account of the travels of Patrick is a goldmine of evidence for the veneration of saintly remains. For example, Tyrachon makes an important claim that Patrick gave his disciple Sechellus a portion of the relics of Peter and Paul, Stephen and Lawrence, which are in Armagh. Now, regardless of how and when the Church of Armagh actually attained these relics, it was clearly using them to strengthen its political position via Tyrachon in the late 7th century. In another episode, Tyrachon recounts how Patrick ordained Olcán and granted him Roman relics in Dunsever, County Antrim. And Tyrachon was concerned with establishing what churches belonged to Patrick, and therefore to Patrick's Church of Armagh. He creates an image of an Irish countryside interspersed with relics bestowed by Patrick and his disciples on the churches that they founded. This reflects the strategic function of saintly remains in authenticating claims and ascertaining the jurisdiction of churches. In general, relics are an important element in Tyrachon's efforts to establish the primacy of Patrick as the founding saint in Ireland in the 5th century, which was very important to Armagh's claims of jurisdiction over churches and territory in the 7th century, so 200 years later. What is implied by Tyrachon's account is the necessity for relics in the foundation and consecration of new churches. This is echoed in other Irish sources, such as the law texts and annals. And annals were essentially records of the major events of each year. Now, indeed, in the early church as a whole, in general, in Europe, what we term Europe now, relics became an intrinsic part of the consecration of churches. And this was popularized by St. Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, in the late 4th century. In many cases, the relics used for church consecration were those distributed from Rome, which bound these churches to Rome, and also it solidified certain Roman agreements and edicts. By the 8th century, relics were essential for the consecration of any Catholic church. In 787, the 7th Ecumenical Council of Nicaea forbade the consecration of a church without a relic, under pain of being deposed. Now, associated with this was another important legal use of relics, which was their increased use in the swearing of oaths and for cementing treaties. This custom was formalized circa 630 AD by Dagobert, king of the Franks, who declared that the presence of relics was needed for the agreement of contracts. And then the famous Holy Roman Emperor, Charlemagne, he further consolidated this legal role of relics. In the year 803, he laid down that all oaths must be sworn in a church or on relics. So similarly, in early Ireland, we see the same thing happening. Legal validity was lent to oaths sworn on saints' remains. For example, one law text states that witnesses took an oath over relics or at a saint's grave. This practice would have continued the pre-Christian custom of swearing in cemeteries. And oath-taking on relics in Ireland became the norm to the extent that the relic term min, in Old Irish, developed the secondary meaning of oath, and it's now actually the standard word for oath, mion, in modern Irish. Now, the political use of relics is well attested in the cult of relics in the church as a whole, and became increasingly integral to the interactions between the church and secular elites in Ireland from the 8th and 9th centuries onwards. Relics, as I said, would be present in the making of agreements and the swearing of oaths, and they were taken on tour to promote a particular saint, to seek intervention, and to exact tributes for the church. Relic circuits provided an opportunity for the collection of revenue and for tributes, and the extent to which this was the primary objective of these circuits is a matter of debate. The timing of some relic circuits coincided with famines or outbreaks of disease, and there may have been a genuine concern for the well-being of the population at a time of undoubted difficulty and hardship. Indeed, in the Irish collection of church canons, medieval church canons, they cited St. Augustine and they included the increase of the evils in society as one of the reasons for the circuit of relics. Additionally, the text criticizes vagrant monks who profit from the sale of relics. However, revenue collection was certainly an important facet of these relic circuits. The early Irish law texts, Coig Cunnar Fugil, Bereth Arachta, and the Heptads all make reference to the earnings of a reliquary. The circuit of relics combines two of the key elements intrinsic to the success of the cult of relics: faith and authority. For the relics of a particular saint to contain any real power and longevity, lay Christians needed to believe in their intercessory power. However, the relics also needed to be an effective resource for the church and the secular elite to be adequately promoted. So a key element here to understanding the importance of relics in medieval society is that we must appreciate the role of the saint, the very active role of the saint in medieval society. Saints bridged the heavenly and earthly realms and acted as intercessors on behalf of believers. Local saints were particularly vital to this process, as they represented a particular area, and thus the clergy and the lay community could specifically identify with him or her. He was a real individual who perhaps one time lived among them and shared many common characteristics and often a common ancestry with the local people. And it was in the Middle Ages, it was this saint that symbolized the local church and community and acted as patron. For example, Cummian, who I mentioned earlier, in his letter, he lists the elder statesmen of the church, so very important men, to whom he's addressing in his letter. He lists them as heirs of the saints rather than as leaders, their current political position as leaders of the church. So he refers to them as the successors of our first fathers, of Bishop Alva, of Ciarán of Clonmacnoise, of Brendan, of Nesson, of Luggett. He addresses his contemporary, Abbot Seigena of Iona, as successor of Holy Columba and of other holy men. So the leaders of the Irish Church in the 7th century were being defined and described in relation to the past saint, not just the present monastery. And this is also reflected in the Irish language. The leaders of the monastic communities in Ireland were often termed coarb or coverba, meaning heir or successor. Thus, they weren't merely abbots or bishops, but they were holders of the office established by the founding saint. In the mid-7th century quasi-legal text, the Liber Angeli, or the Book of the Angel, which is preserved in the Book of Armagh is on display in Trinity College, Dublin. This text shows that the relationships between churches are often expressed as agreements between the saints themselves, who lived centuries previously, rather than the actual current ecclesiastical institutions. So I'm quoting here from the book, as on the slide. Between Holy Patrick and Bridget, dignitaries of the Irish, there existed a great friendship of charity, that they were one heart and one mind. The holy man said to the Christian Virgin, "O my Bridget, your parish will be deemed to be in your province and your dominion, but in the eastern and western part, it will be in my domination." So the description of a pact between Patrick and Bridget, individuals who lived in the 5th and 6th centuries, has no real historical basis. However, this 7th century text likely reflects a real legal agreement at that time over jurisdiction between Armagh, the Church of St. Patrick, and Kildare, the Church of St. Bridget. The Book of the Angel expresses this relationship as a friendship between the two saints. Just throw in, I have a lot of text here, so I'll give you, throw you in a photo. So it shows that the patron saint was intrinsic to the identity and the status of the community. As patrons of communities, saints often represented territorial interests and were symbolic owners and defenders of the land. The saints, of course, were long dead. However, the existence of their relics made them very much alive. Possession of the relics of the saints confirmed this ongoing relationship. So allegiance and association with a saint were represented physically and tangibly in the form of relics. In this way, relics became part of the official emblems and insignia of churches, and as such they were used to represent a church's identity, their position, and their status. Insignia, which means symbols or badges of office, became a specific type of relic venerated for this kind of official association. And as official emblems of a community, relics as insignia represented the saint and his church. If they were disrespected in any manner, for example, by not according the holder of the relics due respect and hospitality, this was equivalent to slighting the actual saint, and proper retribution would be wrought. So, for example, again, in the Book of the Angel, this text promoted the insignia of Patrick as superior to all others. So the text outlines specifically the respect that was due to the Church of Armagh on account of these relics. It says, "Whosoever insults or violates the consecrated insignia of Patrick shall pay twofold." So they're claiming here that the insignia of Patrick are worth twice the insignia of all other churches. The text goes on to say, "Further, whosoever intentionally and wickedly commits an evil deed against his community or insults his aforesaid insignia, the whole affair shall be left to the investigation of the Bishop of Armagh, without reference to other judges." Now, like Armagh, other churches preciously guarded their insignia. Indeed, the authority of insignia is preserved in Con Adamnon, which has been mentioned a couple of times today, and it protects the immunity of the church, her insignia, her sanctuaries, and her property. The text stresses that the insignia or relics of churches merit particular protection if they are if they're damaged or violated in any manner, regardless of the location of the insignia at the time, a full fine is incurred. Likewise, the later life of Maodhóg of Ferns, as I mentioned at the outset, it stresses repeatedly in so many different times that respect was due to the saint. Maodhóg of Ferns was so important because of all his wonderworking insignia. And I don't have time to go through all the details of it now, but I have a couple of quotes here. So the text was actually written centuries later than the other text that I'm discussing today. However, I would just like to briefly discuss it, given the current context, and also it's a fascinating text. There are many different hagiographical texts written about Maodhóg, indicating that he was a very important saint in medieval Ireland. However, this 16th century Irish text is by far the most revealing about the use of relics to attain and maintain power and control. It enunciates very clearly that allegiance and tribute was owed to Maodhóg's community, and in this particular instance, the community he founded in Drumlane, that he's associated with in Drumlane, County Cavan, but it's on account of his relics, the relics that he himself possessed. And it says, "These are the 7 relics which Maodhóg had as arms of battle against the injustice of the race of Éed Finn and others in general. The seed of Éed Finn, therefore, when they see any of the relics, or all of them, are bound to rise and to do obeisance to them." And further, the text says, These are the decisions of Maodhóg, that the people of Éed Fin, we're seeing a theme here, obviously, the composer had an issue with this particular group, that they should honour his churches and his clergy, his relics and his rich insignia, his sanctuaries and strong privileges, and never reject his relics or his stewards or swear falsely by his relics. Now, I don't have time to get into the politics behind these statements. Indeed, I know very little about 16th century history. However, clearly the political context of the time which the text was written was very important, as no other account of Maodhóg goes into so much detail about relics as insignia. And it's interesting just to note how, we've been looking at texts from, centuries earlier that are formulating these ideas, and it's fully realized and expressed in this text. And I'm currently researching a project on the language of relics and the specific terms used in Old Irish and Latin, because we were a bilingual nation and wrote in both languages. And the results of my investigations so far suggest that the specific words used by this author in his account of the life of Maodhóg, such as Irish terms fethel and menester, were very carefully selected as representative of antiquity, power, and prestige. So the use of relics in church and secular politics became a key feature of the cult of relics throughout the medieval era and into early modern and modern periods. Already in late antiquity, relics had circulated as gifts in order to bridge distances, to mark friendship and concord, creating a social as well as a geographical network of solidarity, interdependence, and obligation. Relics played an important role in the influence of Byzantine power broker and Saint Pulcheria, in influencing her brother, Emperor Theodosius II, in his war with Persia in 421 AD. Acting under Pulcheria's influence, Theodosius sent a rich donation for the poor to the Archbishop of Jerusalem, and also a golden cross studded with precious stones to be erected on Golgotha. Crucially, the Archbishop sent relics of the right arm of Stephen in exchange for these gifts. So therefore, the transfer of relics can illuminate the intricate systems of patronage, alliance, and gift-giving that linked the lay and the clerical elites of the East and West in the late Roman Empire. And in 7th century Ireland, Tíreachán demonstrates that compacts and friendships were also solidified in the presence of relics. He narrates a story about a maiden Mathona who came to Patrick in pilgrimage and entered into a solemn compact with the successors of Holy Rhodanus, swearing by his relics, and his successors dined reciprocally with her and established a free church at Tomnach. Now, immediately following this episode, Tíreachán, he gets quite upset, and he criticizes other churches that spurned the overtures of friendship by disciples of Patrick, Bronus and Bithias. He says that they demanded nothing of the community, this particular community of Dumach, except their friendship only, he says. But the community of Clonmacnoise has claimed them, as they hold forcibly many of Patrick's places. Now, the reference to swearing by relics is a mechanism by which Tíreachán he emphasizes the legitimacy of the relationship between Tomnach and Dumach, an authentication that's not possessed by Clonmacnoise. So the phrasing of the episode as well indicates that Mathona and Rhodanus' successors, they entered into a special relationship that was known as Corja in Irish, which would have been established originally by an oath and later confirmed by relics. A further example of this kind of thing can be found in the later life, a later account of Patrick's life, referred to as the tripartite life of Patrick. This text recounts that Clogher's prized possession, the Downach Argid, was a gift of Patrick's. The text says, and Patrick then left Bishop MacCartan and Clogher, and with him he places the silver reliquary called Downach Argid. According to the text, this shrine contained relics of the Holy Apostles, some of the hair of Holy Mary, and a portion of the Holy Cross of the Lord, of his tomb and of other holy relics. MacCartan accordingly founded a church with these relics. And furthermore, the text says that then a custom of reciprocal visiting rights was established between the two churches. And as Professor Wooding said earlier, in the life of David, he gave Maodhóg a bell, which again would have been a physical symbol of their relationship and of allegiance. An example of the use of relics in peacemaking is enshrined in a poem or song that mentions the activities of the abbot of the monastery of Iona called Céline Druchtach, meaning bridge maker. Now, this epithet may refer to Céline's peacemaking activities, in which he used relics to great advantage. The song explains that Céline brought a shrine containing all the relics collected together by Adamnan, that he brought them over to Ireland in order to use these relics to broker a peace treaty between warring factions, the Canail Owen and the Canail Cunnel, in the mid-8th century. So thus, we're getting a bit of an insight into the kind of these delicate threads of alliance that were kind of being facilitated by relics. Now, the desecration of insignia, and by extension of persons intimately connected with them, sometimes in the form of breaking contracts that were made in the presence of relics, was severely discouraged. It is the references to instances in which relics are disrespected that sometimes provides the most valuable insight into these alliances and relationships of power in the early Irish church and society. So, if we look at some of the annalistic records, we have a notorious instance of the desecration of relics in 789 AD. This was the assault by the notorious Donogad of Meath on the staff of Jesus, the Bachal Yeshu, and the relics of Patrick at an Ainach, which is a native Irish term that can kind of be loosely translated as an assembly or a fair. But the context here is very important. An earlier annalistic entry indicates that Donogad supported Iona at this time, which was a rival church to Armagh. It states that in 778, Donogad, ruler of Tara, enforced the law of Columba with the abbot of Iona. So then, within this context, the dishonouring of the insignia of Armagh is very telling. It's a clear statement of allegiance to Iona. Donogad had previously attacked assemblies on at least 2 occasions, and indeed, over a 33-year period, the annals record Donogad's rise to high king, his military might, and his ruthless actions. His dominating presence pervades the folio of the annals this time. His unremitting military aggression allowed his dynasty, the Clan Cholmán, to consolidate their control of the Midlands. And the annalistic record of 789 provides an insight into the interaction of secular and ecclesiastical leaders, and also into contention over the leadership of Armagh, over the abbacy of Armagh, in the late 8th century. Indeed, there's some evidence to suggest that this record of 789 could be an indication that Donogad opposed Dubh Dálaitha's abbacy. He was vying for the abbacy of Armagh at that time. And in order to undermine him, he seized the relics which represented his authority. There was further controversy concerning the Ainach Atalchu in 811 AD. The annals say it was prevented from being held on a Saturday by Aidh, son of Neil, neither horse nor chariot arriving there. The community of Tala instigated the boycott after their sanctuary was violated by the Ineil, who were subsequently forced to appease Tala with the bestowal of gifts. Now, 2 years earlier, in 809, the Ineil had been attacked in a similar manner. In 809, the annals record the murder of Dún superior of the community of Tullyleash in County Down, beside the shrine of Patrick. We're informed later in the same year that the repercussion of this act was an attack from Aidh, son of Neil. The invasion of Ullad as a result of the profanation of Patrick's shrine at the expense of Dún. The reaction of the community wasn't just in response to the killing of Dún. it was also the disrespectful manner of doing it next to the shrine of Patrick. Relics were meant to provide protection and sanctuary, so it was a gross violation to commit such a heinous crime in a sacred space. And it also showed contempt of Patrick, not just of Dún Chú. So it was a matter of honour for aides to retaliate against this. Like Donogad, Aids was very astute at harnessing the power of relics and appreciating their various uses. Now, the desecration of relics sometimes had grave consequences. Let's skip it. The annals tell us that in 831 AD, the Ainach of Taltu was disturbed owing to dissension over the shrine of Macuillin and the relics of Patrick, and many died as a result. This clear attack on the authority of the insignia of Armagh may possibly also be reflected in the capture of Owen, Abbot of Armagh, later in the same year. Now, it is this record, it's one of many that draw attention to the role of relics in ecclesiastical politics in the 9th century, especially in relation to Armagh. Not only was possession of the insignia important to command respect from other communities, but also the holder of the insignia demanded deference from rivals to his position within the community itself. So the context behind another note in the annals sheds further light on this phenomenon. And this is my last example here now. So in 836 AD, the annals state that the relics of Patrick were taken on tour by Diarmait, who went to Connacht. Now, this circuit of Patrick's relics by Diarmait occurred at a time in conflict within Armagh, with rival claimants to the abbacy, Diarmait and Foranon, fighting a protracted battle of control. Now, each claimant used relics to his advantage, with Diarmait ultimately succeeding to the rank of abbot in 834. Now, his position came under threat from Foranon soon after, and the two clerics kept on contesting the abbacy for 17 years. And the annals show us that they kept using relics. One of them had the relics at one stage, and then another had the relics at the other stage. And the person who held the insignia of Patrick was the person who held the office. And it was very important that you held those symbols of the authority of the position. So just suffice it to say that the conflict between the two was just a culmination of a prolonged period of unrest at Armagh, characterised by the contention of the role of abbot and as heir of Patrick. Now, throughout this tumultuous period, relics were respected, they were venerated, they were marketed, and they were defamed. It is clear that relics impacted greatly on the interactions between the secular and ecclesiastical elite, and this is especially apparent in the actions of rival claimants to the Armagh abbacy. While the man physically located at Armagh could base his claim upon that presence, the absent or expelled opponent could use Patrick's insignia as authentication of his claims. I've only briefly sketched some of the political uses of relics in medieval Ireland. However, I hope to have shown that we can see that relics were more than just holy items to be revered by the faithful, and they were, and which I haven't had a chance to explore today, but they were also administrative tools used in the day-to-day running of the church. And the evolution of relics into insignia and official emblems became a useful tool at the church's disposal in its interaction with lay society. The sources convey a clear sense of the political use of relics to attain and maintain influence by clerical and secular elites, and an understanding by these elites, they had a real understanding of how to interact with lay society, that relics were vehicles with which to control the faithful in general. And an important element here was that relics were symbols of authority and power. However, we mustn't adopt an over-cynical view of relics in early medieval Ireland, or indeed of relics in general. The enduring power of the cult, the veneration of relics, despite recent criticism of the hierarchy of the power and control of the Catholic Church, reflects that there is an inherent appeal and an important appeal to the lay community. Okay, thank you.